Transparency is the foundation of accountability. In this segment, you will see unfiltered and unedited reality. We are presenting raw, primary footage directly from the front lines of justice, offering you an objective window into the complexities of the law.
That was Officer Derek Matthews of the D.C. Metro Police Department arresting Judge Diane Carter outside the Fairmont Hotel on the evening of November 3rd, 2024, at approximately 9:31 p.m. Matthews thought he'd caught a prostitute soliciting outside a luxury hotel. What he'd actually done was handcuff a U.S. District Court federal judge with 15 years on the bench, a civil rights law specialist who had personally sentenced police officers for misconduct, and someone who had keynoted a police reform conference on racial profiling in that exact hotel just 2 hours earlier. The arrest lasted 28 minutes. The fallout lasted 13 months. By the time Matthews realized his mistake, Judge Carter had been transported to the station, fingerprinted, photographed for a mugshot, and processed through booking, while her conference badge, clearly reading Honorable Diane Carter, U.S. District Court, sat clipped to her purse the entire time. The video went viral within 12 hours. The lawsuit was filed within 9 days. The criminal charges were filed 2 months later. The settlement, $4.2 million, was finalized in June 2025. Derek Matthews was fired within 5 days, convicted of federal civil rights violations 11 months later, and sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. Not because this was his first mistake, but because the investigation uncovered what 47 prior arrests had already documented: a pattern of racial profiling targeting black women in circumstances where verification was not just possible, it was required. This is the story of what happens when a cop's assumptions meet a federal judge's authority and consequences finally arrive. Judge Diane Carter, 52 years old, U.S. District Court judge appointed to the bench in 2009. Civil rights law specialist, former public defender, a woman who had spent 15 years ruling on cases of police misconduct, who had sentenced officers for the exact behavior Derek Matthews was about to commit, a woman who did everything right. And it still wasn't enough. Before we continue, where are you watching from? This story starts in Washington, D.C., but the pattern it reveals exists everywhere. If this kind of accountability matters to you, hit like and subscribe. We cover Justice Serves stories every week, and your support keeps these investigations coming. Let's get into it. Diane Carter didn't become a federal judge by accident. She grew up in Southeast D.C. in the 1970s and 80s. Back when the city was still called the murder capital, back when being a black girl with aspirations meant people told you to be realistic. Her father was a metro bus driver. Her mother cleaned office buildings at night. And Diane learned early that the system wasn't designed to protect people who looked like her. She saw it firsthand at 15 when her older brother was stopped by police for walking home from basketball practice. No crime, no call, just a black teenager in a Georgetown neighborhood where someone thought he didn't belong. The officers searched him, roughed him up, and told him to stay out of their area. Her brother came home shaken. Her parents filed a complaint. Nothing happened. Diane decided then that if the system wouldn't protect her family, she learned the system well enough to change it. She went to Howard University on a full scholarship, law school at Georgetown, graduated top of her class, spent 8 years as a public defender representing people the system had already written off. Then another 7 as a civil rights attorney, taking on police departments, housing discrimination cases, employment law violations. In 2009, at 37 years old, she was appointed to the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, one of the youngest federal judges in the country, and one of the few who'd spent her entire career fighting the kind of injustice most judges only read about in case files. Over 15 years on the bench, Judge Carter built a reputation: fair, thorough, uncompromising when it came to civil rights. She'd sentenced police officers for excessive force, ruled against qualified immunity in cases where cops claimed they didn't know they were violating someone's rights. Written opinions that became precedent in how courts evaluate racial profiling claims. And on November 3rd, 2024, she just finished delivering the keynote address at the National Police Reform Conference, a 2-day event held at the Fairmont Hotel, attended by over 300 law enforcement officials, attorneys, and policy experts from across the country. Her speech was titled, "Seeing Beyond the Uniform: How Implicit Bias Shapes Police Encounters." She spent 40 minutes walking through case studies, real incidents, black professionals mistaken for criminals, women of color profiled in their own neighborhoods, the psychological mechanisms that let officers see what they expect to see instead of what's actually in front of them. She ended with a challenge that every officer in that room had a choice to recognize their biases and correct them, or to keep pretending they didn't exist and keep destroying lives. The room gave her a standing ovation. Sergeant Raymond Cole, a 24-year veteran of D.C. Metro Police, shook her hand afterward and told her it was the most important speech he'd heard in his career. 2 hours later, she was standing outside that same hotel in handcuffs. She'd changed out of her professional suit into an elegant black cocktail dress, something appropriate for the evening reception she'd just left. Her judicial conference badge was still clipped to her clutch. Her bar card and federal credentials were inside. She'd ordered an Uber at 9:28 p.m. and stepped outside to wait for it, same as thousands of people do every night in every city. And Officer Derek Matthews, driving past on patrol, saw a black woman in a nice dress standing outside a hotel at night and decided he knew exactly what she was. He didn't see a federal judge. He didn't see someone who'd spent her life fighting injustice. He didn't see a woman who'd given a speech about him, about officers like him. Just 2 hours earlier in that exact building, he saw what 12 years of unchecked bias had trained him to see, and he made the worst decision of his life. Officer Derek Matthews had been with D.C. Metro Police for 12 years. He'd worked patrol in multiple districts. He'd made hundreds of arrests. And he'd developed what he thought was an instinct for spotting criminal activity. What he'd actually developed was a pattern documented in 2 prior excessive force complaints, both involving black civilians, both dismissed after cursory internal investigations. A pattern his supervisors had noted but never meaningfully addressed. A pattern that was about to cost him everything. At 9:29 p.m. on November 3rd, Matthews was driving southbound past the Fairmont Hotel when he saw Judge Carter standing near the valet area checking her phone. She was alone, dressed in what he'd later describe in his report as provocative attire. A description that would be demolished in court when photos showed a knee-length cocktail dress, professional heels, and a small clutch purse. He pulled his patrol car to the curb and activated his body cam as he exited the vehicle. The footage that would later go viral, viewed over 45 million times, starts at exactly 9:31:47 p.m. Matthews approached and told her she needed to move along, that he'd had complaints about solicitation in the area. Judge Carter looked up from her phone, confused, and asked what he was talking about. Matthews told her she knew exactly what he meant, that standing outside a hotel at this hour, dressed like that, he'd seen it before. Judge Carter's expression shifted, not to fear, she'd spent too many years in courtrooms to be intimidated, but to the controlled anger of someone realizing what was happening. She told him she was waiting for her Uber, asked if there was a problem. Matthews said the problem was he didn't buy it. Then he asked, on camera, with the body cam audio capturing every word, how much she charged. Judge Carter went still. Then she told him, clearly and calmly, that she was a federal judge, that he was making a serious mistake. Matthews laughed. Not a polite chuckle, an actual laugh. He told her that if she were really a judge, she'd know better than to lie to a police officer. She opened her clutch. The conference badge, Honorable Diane Carter, U.S. District Court, was clipped to the outside, clearly visible. She pulled out her bar card and her federal judicial credentials, held them up, told him to look at them. Matthews barely glanced at them, said those could be fake, that people bought fake IDs all the time. He told her to turn around and put her hands behind her back. Judge Carter asked if he was seriously arresting her. Matthews said she could explain it downtown. And then she said something that would be played in courtrooms, news segments, and civil rights training sessions for years. She told him, quietly, evenly, voice steady, that she had sentenced officers for civil rights violations before, that he was making the worst decision of his career, that everything he was doing was on camera and would be reviewed by people who actually understood the law. Matthews told her to save it for the judge. Judge Carter said, barely above a whisper, I am the judge. The handcuffs clicked into place at 9:33 p.m. 2 minutes and 13 seconds from first contact to arrest. 0 verification of her identity. 0 probable cause beyond her race and her clothing. 0 attempt to de-escalate or investigate his own assumptions. Jamal Washington, the hotel valet, had been watching from the entrance. He pulled out his phone and started recording. By 9:35, Judge Carter was in the back of Matthews's patrol car, hands cuffed behind her back, conference badge still visible on her clutch. By 9:41, she was en route to the 3rd District Station, and by 9:53, she was being walked through the booking process while Matthews filled out an arrest report charging her with solicitation. At no point during the transport did Matthews call his supervisor. At no point did he verify her credentials with anyone. At no point did it occur to him that a federal judge, someone with institutional authority over his entire legal system, might be telling the truth. He was so confident in his assumptions that he didn't even consider the possibility that he was wrong, and that confidence would destroy him. Sergeant Raymond Cole had been on the job for 24 years. He'd worked patrol, narcotics, violent crimes. He'd seen just about everything a cop could see in a major city. And at 10:04 p.m. on November 3rd, he walked into the booking area of the 3rd District Station to start his overnight shift and saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Judge Diane Carter, standing at the booking desk, in handcuffs. Cole had been at her conference speech that afternoon. He'd shaken her hand. He'd told her it was one of the most important talks he'd ever heard. And now, 6 hours later, she was in a station being processed for prostitution. He looked at Matthews, then at Judge Carter, then at the booking officer, and then he said 5 words that would later appear in the Internal Affairs report. "What the hell is this?" Matthews turned and started to explain that he'd arrested a woman for solicitation outside the Fairmont, that she'd been uncooperative, that she'd claimed to be a federal judge, but the ID looked fake. Cole cut him off mid-sentence, asked Matthews if he knew who this was. Matthews said she'd claimed to be Judge Carter, but he didn't believe her. Cole walked over to Judge Carter and apologized, told the booking officer to uncuff her immediately, turned to Matthews and told him to step outside. Now. Judge Carter stood there for a moment, wrists red from the cuffs, still wearing her evening dress, still holding her clutch with the conference badge clipped to it. She'd been fingerprinted, photographed for a mugshot, run through the system like every other person arrested that night. The booking officer who'd processed her hadn't recognized her either. He'd just done his job, following the paperwork Matthews had filled out. Cole asked if she was okay. Judge Carter said she was fine, but that she wanted everything. The Bodycam footage, the booking records, the arrest report, all of it, preserved as evidence. Cole said it was already done. He called Captain Jennifer Ross at home and woke her up, told her they had a situation, a bad one, that one of her officers had just arrested a federal judge for prostitution. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Ross asked if he was serious. Cole said he was looking at Judge Carter right now. Ross said she'd be there in 20 minutes and told Cole not to let Matthews leave the building. Outside the booking area, Matthews was starting to realize something had gone very wrong, but he still didn't fully understand. He told Cole there must be some mistake, that the woman had been soliciting, that her ID looked fake, that he'd done everything by the book. Cole asked him if he'd verified her identity with anyone before arresting her. Matthews said he didn't need to. He could tell when someone was lying. Cole asked if he'd called a supervisor before making the arrest. Matthews said it wasn't necessary for a solicitation charge. Cole asked if he'd looked at her conference badge. Matthews said anyone could get a fake badge. Then Cole asked the question that would later be used in the criminal trial. He asked Matthews if he'd arrested this woman because she was black and standing outside a hotel in a nice dress. Matthews said that had nothing to do with it. Cole asked what probable cause he'd had. Matthews said her behavior was consistent with solicitation. Cole asked what behavior specifically. Matthews couldn't give a clear answer, because there was no behavior. There was just a black woman standing outside a hotel waiting for a car. And Matthews had seen what his bias told him to see. Captain Ross arrived at 10:26 p.m. She took one look at Judge Carter, still in the booking area, now sitting in a chair with a cup of water someone had gotten her, and immediately understood the magnitude of the disaster. She apologized to Judge Carter personally, told her they would conduct a full investigation, asked if she needed medical attention or if there was anything the department could do. Judge Carter said she needed two things: her phone call, which she was legally entitled to after being arrested, and a copy of every piece of documentation related to this incident. Ross said she'd have both within the hour. At 10:41 p.m., Judge Carter called Michael Preston, a civil rights attorney she'd known for over a decade, told him what had happened. Preston asked if she was serious. She said she had the mugshot to prove it. Preston said he'd be at the station in 15 minutes and told her not to say another word to anyone without him present. By 11 p.m., Matthews had been placed on immediate administrative leave. By 11:30 p.m., Internal Affairs had been notified and the Bodycam footage had been flagged for preservation. And by midnight, Jamal Washington's phone video, shot from the hotel entrance, showing the entire arrest from approach to handcuffs, had been posted online with the caption, "DC Cop arrests federal judge for prostitution while she waits for Uber." By 2 a.m., it had 400,000 views. By 8 a.m. the next morning, it was on every major news network. And by the end of the day, Officer Derek Matthews' face, name, and 12-year career in law enforcement were known to millions of people. All because he couldn't see past his own racism long enough to recognize that the woman in front of him was exactly who she said she was. The video Jamal Washington posted at midnight went viral in a way that few stories do, not just because of what happened, but because of who it happened to and how thoroughly it exposed the lie that respectability could protect you from racism. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity that could be explained away. This was a federal judge, someone with credentials, institutional power, and a visible conference badge, arrested for prostitution because a cop looked at a black woman and decided she couldn't possibly be who she said she was. The body cam footage made it worse. Matthews' laugh when she identified herself, his dismissal of her credentials, his refusal to verify her identity, and that final exchange, "Save it for the judge, I am the judge," became the moment that defined the entire story. By November 4th at noon, the video had been viewed over 8 million times. The Washington Post ran the story on the front page. NPR covered it in their morning segment. CNN played the body cam footage on a loop. Every civil rights organization in the country released statements. And Judge Carter's conference speech on implicit bias, delivered just hours before her arrest, was being replayed and shared as the most grimly ironic moment in recent legal history. People found the full conference video online, watched her talk about how officers make assumptions based on race and appearance, heard her describe the exact scenario that had just happened to her, and then saw the footage of her in handcuffs, proving her own point in the worst possible way. By November 5th, D.C. Metro Police Chief Harold Banks held a press conference. He called the arrest unacceptable and inconsistent with department values, said a full investigation was underway, announced that Matthews had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome, and offered a formal apology to Judge Carter. Judge Carter held her own press conference that same afternoon. She stood at a podium in her judicial robes, a deliberate choice, a visual reminder of who she was and what Matthews had failed to see. She didn't speak from notes. She didn't soften anything. She said that what happened to her was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a system that had failed to hold officers accountable for patterns of racial bias. That she had been arrested not because of anything she did, but because of what Officer Matthews assumed based on her race and gender. That if this could happen to a federal judge with credentials and a visible badge and witnesses, it was happening to countless others who didn't have her platform or resources to fight back. And then she said something that would shape everything that followed. She said she would not be filing a complaint and walking away, that she would be using every legal tool available to ensure this was investigated thoroughly, prosecuted if warranted, and used as a catalyst for systemic change. That Officer Matthews' career was finished, but that wasn't enough. The department that allowed him to operate unchecked for 12 years needed to answer for that failure. The press conference was watched live by over 2 million people. Clips from it were shared millions more times. And by the time it was over, Derek Matthews wasn't just a cop who'd made a bad arrest. He was the face of everything wrong with policing in America. Michael Preston, Judge Carter's attorney, filed a federal lawsuit on November 12th. The complaint was 62 pages. It named Matthews as the primary defendant. It named the D.C. Metro Police Department for failure to train and supervise. And it cited Matthews' two prior excessive force complaints, both involving black civilians, both dismissed without meaningful investigation, as evidence of a pattern the department had ignored. But the lawsuit was just the beginning, because once the story broke, other women started coming forward. Victoria Chen was the first. She'd been arrested by Derek Matthews in August 2019 for loitering with intent to solicit. She'd been standing outside a hotel in Georgetown at 10 p.m., waiting for her boyfriend to bring the car around after a work dinner. Matthews approached, questioned her, didn't believe her explanation, and arrested her. The charges were dropped 3 days later when her employer, a law firm where she worked as a paralegal, submitted documentation proving where she'd been and why. Victoria had filed a complaint with Internal Affairs. It went nowhere. She considered suing but didn't have the money for a lawyer and didn't think anyone would care about a paralegal versus a police officer. When she saw Judge Carter's story, she reached out to Michael Preston. He took her case immediately. Then came Angela Morris, arrested by Matthews in 2021 outside a hotel in DuPont Circle. She'd been a conference attendee, standing outside smoking a cigarette while waiting for her Uber. Matthews arrested her for solicitation. She spent 4 hours in custody before her husband, an attorney, showed up and threatened legal action. The charges were dropped. She'd filed a complaint. Nothing happened. Then Nicole Harper, then Jasmine Taylor, then 2 more. All black women, all arrested by Matthews outside hotels or in commercial districts, all charged with solicitation or loitering, all charges dropped within days, all complaints dismissed or ignored, 6 women, over 5 years. The same officer, the same pattern. And the D.C. Metro Police Department had done nothing. Preston filed amended complaints adding all 6 as plaintiffs. The case stopped being about one bad arrest and became about systemic failure. About a department that had received multiple complaints about the same officer targeting black women and had dismissed every single one. About supervisors who'd seen the pattern and done nothing. About a culture that protected officers over civilians. The Internal Affairs investigation into Matthews was completed by late November. The findings were damning. Matthews had made 47 arrests for solicitation over his 12-year career. 41 of them involved women of color. 38 of those arrests had resulted in dropped charges or acquittals. And in not a single case had Matthews been disciplined or retrained. The IA report recommended termination. On November 8th, 5 days after the arrest, Derek Matthews was fired from the D.C. Metro Police Department. His appeal was denied by the police union after they reviewed the Bodycam footage and the pattern evidence. Even they wouldn't defend him. But the criminal case was what mattered, because this wasn't just about a job. This was about whether Matthews would face actual legal consequences for what he'd done. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia opened an investigation in December 2024. They had the body cam footage. They had Judge Carter's testimony. They had 6 other victims. They had Matthews' own arrest report in which he described Judge Carter as wearing provocative clothing and behaving in a manner consistent with prostitution. Descriptions that fell apart the moment anyone looked at the actual evidence. In January 2025, Derek Matthews was indicted on 2 federal charges: deprivation of rights under color of law and making a false arrest without probable cause, both felonies. Combined, they carried a maximum of 11 years in federal prison. His attorney tried to negotiate a plea. The prosecutors weren't interested. Judge Carter wasn't interested. This was going to trial, and it was going to be public, and every piece of evidence was going to be entered into the record so that no one could ever say it wasn't that bad or it was just a misunderstanding. The civil case settled first, in June 2025, after mediation and negotiations that Judge Carter's attorney described as the most one-sided he'd ever seen. The D.C. Metro Police Department agreed to a settlement, $4,200,000. A formal written apology from the chief of police to be read in open court. Mandatory retraining for all officers on racial bias and proper arrest procedures. and an independent review of all of Matthews's prior arrests with automatic expungement for anyone whose charges had been dropped. Judge Carter took the entire settlement and did exactly what she'd said she would. She created the Diane Carter Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit that provides free legal representation to people falsely arrested or racially profiled by police. The fund launched in July 2025. Within 6 months, it had helped 83 people, most of them black and brown, most of them arrested for crimes they didn't commit, all of them without the resources or platform that Judge Carter had. Derek Matthews' criminal trial was scheduled for September 2025. Before it could begin, the Department of Justice opened a broader investigation into the D.C. Metro Police Department's handling of complaints related to racial bias. The investigation, triggered in part by the 6 additional victims who came forward, is ongoing as of early 2026. Matthews was convicted on both counts in October 2025. He was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison in December. His law license was suspended, his pension was revoked, and he will spend the rest of his life known as the cop who arrested a federal judge because he couldn't see past his own racism. Judge Diane Carter returned to the bench in January 2025. She'd taken a 2-month leave after the incident, not because she was afraid or broken, but because she needed time to process what had happened and decide how to move forward. She came back different, not harder, not angrier, but more determined. Because she'd always known intellectually that her status wouldn't protect her from racism, but experiencing it, being handcuffed, fingerprinted, photographed, processed like a criminal while holding credentials that should have stopped the entire thing before it started, changed something. She'd spent her career fighting injustice from the bench. Now she was going to fight it from everywhere else, too. The Diane Carter Legal Defense Fund opened its offices in July 2025 in Southeast D.C., not far from where Judge Carter had grown up. It was deliberate. She wanted it in a neighborhood where people knew what it felt like to be targeted, to be dismissed, to be told by authority figures that they were lying even when they were telling the truth. The fund provides free legal representation in civil rights cases, false arrests, excessive force, wrongful detention, racial profiling. It's staffed by attorneys who believe that access to justice shouldn't depend on your ability to pay, and it's funded entirely by the settlement Judge Carter received for being arrested while waiting for an Uber. In its first 6 months, the fund took on 83 cases. In its first year, that number grew to over 200. People who'd been arrested for walking in the wrong neighborhood, for standing outside their own homes, for driving cars that officers decided were too nice for them to own, for existing while black in spaces that made white people uncomfortable. Victoria Chen, the paralegal who'd been arrested by Matthews in 2019, became one of the fund's first intake coordinators. She helps screen cases, connects people with attorneys, and reminds them that what happened to them wasn't their fault. She tells them about Judge Carter, about how even a federal judge couldn't escape racism, but how she used what happened to build something that would outlast the pain. The Bodycam footage of Judge Carter's arrest is now used in police training across the country, not as an example of what to do, as a warning of what happens when you let bias override basic professional judgment. It's shown at police academies, at continuing education sessions, at internal affairs investigations. And every time it's played, someone has to confront the fact that Derek Matthews wasn't an outlier. He was the system working exactly as it was designed, to assume guilt, to dismiss evidence, and to trust the officer's gut over the civilian's truth. Judge Carter still gives the occasional speech at police reform conferences, but now, when she talks about implicit bias, she doesn't just cite case studies. She talks about November 3rd, 2024, about standing outside a hotel with credentials in her hand and a badge on her purse, and a cop who looked at her and saw a crime. About what it feels like to tell the truth and be called a liar. About the specific humiliation of being handcuffed and processed and photographed while people who should have known better look the other way. And then she talks about what came after, about the 6 women who came forward, about the fund that now helps hundreds of people, about systemic change that's slow but real, about how sometimes justice doesn't look like one person getting punished. It looks like building something that makes sure the next person has a fighting chance. Derek Matthews is serving his sentence at a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania. He'll be eligible for release in mid-2026. He's tried to appeal his conviction twice. Both appeals were denied. His name is permanently entered into a national database of officers terminated for misconduct, which means he'll never work in law enforcement again. Sergeant Raymond Cole, who recognized Judge Carter at the station, was promoted to lieutenant in 2025. He now oversees training for the department and has made implicit bias recognition a mandatory part of the curriculum. He says he thinks about that night every time he teaches, about how close the department came to sweeping it under the rug if the wrong person had been working booking that night. And Judge Carter, she's still on the bench, still ruling on cases, still writing opinions that become precedent. But now when she sentences an officer for civil rights violations or rules against qualified immunity, or writes an opinion explaining why racial profiling is never justified no matter what an officer's gut tells them, people know she's not speaking theoretically. She knows exactly what it looks like when the system fails, because she's been on both sides of it. Sometimes people ask her if she regrets taking the case public, if she wishes she just accepted the apology and moved on quietly. She says no, because staying quiet would have protected the department more than it would have protected her. And she didn't spend 15 years fighting injustice from the bench just to let it slide when it happened to her. The night of November 3rd, 2024, Derek Matthews looked at a black woman in an evening dress and saw what his racism told him to see. He didn't see a federal judge. He didn't see someone who'd spent her life fighting for justice. He didn't see a human being deserving of basic respect and professional courtesy. He saw an assumption, and that assumption cost him everything. But it gave something back to the hundreds of people who now have legal representation because of what Judge Carter built from the wreckage. It gave something back to the 6 women who were finally believed. It gave something back to every person who sees that body cam footage and realizes that if it can happen to a federal judge, it can happen to anyone. And that means it's everyone's responsibility to demand better. Justice doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it's not just about punishment. Sometimes it's about making sure that what happened to you becomes the thing that protects the next person. That's what $4,200,000 bought. Not comfort, not revenge. A future where the next black woman standing outside a hotel waiting for her Uber doesn't have to prove she's human to a cop who's already decided she's not. If this story hit you, share it. Not just because Derek Matthews got what he deserved or because the settlement was massive, but because Judge Diane Carter spent November 3rd, 2024 doing exactly what thousands of black women do every day, existing in professional spaces, doing her job, and being excellent at it, and still got arrested because a cop couldn't imagine she was telling the truth. That's the part that doesn't get enough attention. Not the arrest, not the viral video. The fact that credentials don't protect you. That a badge identifying you as a federal judge doesn't protect you. That doing everything right, having the documentation, staying calm, explaining yourself clearly, none of it protects you when someone has already decided what you are. But here's what matters. Judge Carter didn't just survive that night. She used it. Took every dollar of that settlement and built something that would outlast the pain. The Diane Carter Legal Defense Fund has helped over 200 people in its first year. People who didn't have her platform, people who didn't have her resources, people who just needed someone to believe them when they said they didn't do anything wrong. That's the legacy. Not Matthews in prison, not the viral video. The hundreds of people who have legal representation now because of what she built. Drop a comment below. Have you or someone you know ever been profiled or falsely accused by law enforcement? Or tell me, what would you have done in Judge Carter's position? I read every single comment. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because this is a channel that tells stories that need to be told. Stories that expose injustice, hold power accountable, and remind us that sometimes the camera catches everything. Don't miss the next one.
Uncovering the truth is more important now than ever. Our goal is to hold power to account by letting the evidence speak for itself. The records don't lie. Thanks for watching and being part of this journey.